Hello, everyone, and
Hi,
welcome
Ethan.
back to Emotional Edge,
Emily, it's
where
so
every
good to
story
see you.
touches the heart and
So good to
reminds us
see you.
that kindness can change
it's
everything.
okay.
Today's tale begins with a quiet apology. A young single mother stepping into a sunlit
We will
cafe.
see you soon.
Her little boy's
Bye-bye.
hand wrapped
Goodbye.
tightly in hers, whispering, "I'm sorry. I had to bring my son." She expected judgment, but
I am here
instead
for
the
you,
man
and I
across
will
the
always
table,
be
a
here for
calm, gentle CEO, smiled and reached out for the child. No one realized that simple gesture would change 3 lives forever. A spilled drink, a laugh, and a stranger's compassion would turn awkwardness into warmth and loneliness into connection. By the time the afternoon light faded, the man who had stopped believing in love found himself holding a child like he'd always belonged there. And the woman who had forgotten what hope felt like saw it quietly reflected in his eyes. Stay with us until the end, because sometimes love doesn't arrive with roses. It walks in with a diaper bag and a second chance. The late afternoon sun spilled through the tall glass panes of the Silver Willow Cafe, painting warm stripes across polished wooden tables. Emily Hart stood by the entrance, her heart racing so loudly she could almost hear it over the clinking of cups and the low hum of conversation. Her chestnut brown hair brushed against her cheek as she bent down, whispering to the little boy gripping her hand. "Noah, sweetheart, we have to be good, okay?" The boy nodded solemnly, his stuffed bunny dangling from one small hand. She adjusted her simple pastel blouse, the one that made her feel a little less invisible, and took a steadying breath before walking in. Everything about the cafe screamed of a world she didn't belong to. The white linens, the suits, the polished shoes tapping against marble. She spotted him near the window. Ethan Cole, the man she'd agreed to meet after a mutual friend's persistent suggestion. He looked exactly like she imagined a CEO would, confident, composed, the sunlight glinting off his watch as he stirred his coffee. When his eyes lifted to meet hers, she froze. For a moment, she almost turned back. But then, Noah tugged her sleeve, and she forced a smile. "I'm sorry," she said quickly as she reached the table. "I had to bring my son." Her voice cracked with apology. Ethan blinked, then rose from his seat, his tall frame unfolding with unexpected gentleness. "No need to apologize," he said, pulling out a chair. "He's welcome." His tone wasn't pitying. It was calm, genuine, and that startled her more than any judgment could have. As they sat, Noah's bright eyes wandered curiously over the silverware. Emily reached for the menu, pretending not to notice Ethan's subtle smile as he watched her fidget with the edge of her napkin. "You work at a bakery?" he asked, his voice even and low. "Yes," she murmured. "Mostly mornings. Cookies and pies. Nothing fancy." He nodded. "Sounds like honest work." She didn't know how to respond, so she just smiled faintly, grateful for his lack of pretense. For a moment, it felt like maybe this wasn't a mistake after all. But then Noah reached for his glass of water. It slipped. The glass tipped, and a flood of cold water cascaded across the white tablecloth, soaking the edge of Ethan's sleeve. "Oh no!" Emily gasped, springing to her feet, fumbling for napkins. "I'm so sorry, "It's okay," Ethan interrupted gently, his voice steady despite the mess. "Really." But she was mortified. "I shouldn't have brought him. I can't believe—" Her words broke off when Noah's lip trembled. The little boy's eyes welled up, and his tiny voice cracked into a whimper. "Mommy, sorry." That was when Ethan stood. Without hesitation, he knelt beside the child. "Hey, it's okay, buddy," he said softly, his deep voice suddenly warm and fatherly. "No harm done." He reached out a hand, waiting for Noah's nod before lifting him into his arms. Emily froze, hands still clutching napkins. Noah's cries quieted almost instantly as Ethan held him, his large hand resting carefully on the boy's back. The cafe seemed to fade, the chatter, the plates, the flicker of sunlight, all softened into silence. For the first time in a long while, Emily saw her son at peace in someone else's arms. "He's okay," Ethan said, looking up with a reassuring smile that made her chest ache. "Just needed a little kindness, I think." She swallowed hard, blinking back tears she didn't understand. He motioned for her to sit. "Please, Emily. Let's start again." As she sank into her seat, Ethan gently bounced Noah on his knee, pretending to make a small airplane sound that drew a soft giggle from the boy. Emily couldn't help but laugh too, a light, surprised sound that broke through her embarrassment. The golden sunlight filtered across their table, framing the three of them like a photograph frozen in warmth. For the first time that day, Emily forgot the whispers that said she didn't belong. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something kind, something real. The morning sun poured softly through the cafe windows, glinting off the silver cutlery as the scent of fresh coffee drifted between them. Emily sat across from Ethan, still feeling the heat in her cheeks from yesterday's embarrassment, though he'd made it impossible to feel ashamed for long. He hadn't flinched, hadn't judged, not even when Noah had spilled water all over his sleeve. Instead, he'd smiled, that calm, steady kind of smile that felt like forgiveness. Now, as they met again for breakfast, something between them had changed, though neither dared to name it. Ethan stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, eyes lingering on Noah, who was sitting in a high chair, happily smearing butter across his toast. "He's got a good appetite," Ethan said, his tone light. Emily laughed softly. "He eats like he's training for a marathon. Keeps me running, too." Her laughter carried a nervous undertone. Years of being cautious, years of learning that kindness often came with strings attached. But Ethan's gaze held no conditions, only curiosity, and an odd gentleness she didn't expect from a man who owned half the town's skyline. "You mentioned you bake," he said. "You like it?" She nodded. "It's all I have time for, and maybe the only thing I'm really good at." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Don't say that like it's small. The world could use more people who make things that make others happy." She looked up, startled by the sincerity in his tone, and for a moment, she forgot to be guarded. Noah suddenly began tapping his spoon against his plate, humming his own off-key tune. Emily tried to hush him, but Ethan chuckled, taking the spoon and pretending to tap a rhythm back. "Is that your song, buddy?" Noah giggled, clapping. Something about that sound filled the air with light. For a brief moment, Emily saw them. This man and her son, framed by the morning glow, and she felt a pang so sharp it frightened her. She had trained herself not to hope, but watching Ethan make silly faces to calm her child, she couldn't help but imagine how different life could be if she wasn't always fighting it alone. "He likes you," she said quietly. "Kids are smart," Ethan replied. "They can sense who's safe." He didn't mean it to sting, but Emily felt her throat tighten anyway. Safe. It had been a long time since she'd trusted anyone enough to believe that word. She looked out the window instead, watching the sunlight stretch over the cobblestones outside. "I didn't plan any of this," she murmured. "Being a mom this young, doing it alone. Sometimes I still don't know if I'm doing it right." Ethan followed her gaze, his voice low and even. "You're here. You're trying. That's more than most." There was no pity, only truth. She turned back to him, blinking hard. "You talk like you've been through something," she said. Ethan's jaw tightened almost, imperceptibly. "I have," he admitted. "A long time ago, I was engaged. Her name was Claire. She died in a car accident 6 months before the wedding." The air seemed to still around them. Even Noah, suddenly quiet, stared at Ethan as if he could sense the heaviness in the man's voice. I stopped trusting myself after that, Ethan continued softly. Stopped letting people in. It's easier to keep life tidy when no one can hurt you. Emily's hands fidgeted with the edge of her napkin, her heart aching for him. I'm sorry, she whispered. You don't need to be, he said, forcing a small smile. Somehow, sitting here with you and Noah, it doesn't feel so heavy anymore. She didn't know what to say to that, so she simply nodded, afraid to move, afraid the fragile peace between them might shatter if she spoke too loudly. Then Noah looked up, his little voice piping through the quiet like a bell. Dada. Both adults froze. Emily's breath caught, and she shook her head quickly, her cheeks flushing. No, no, baby, he's not. But Ethan interrupted, his expression soft, eyes crinkling with the faintest smile. It's okay, he said gently. I don't mind. He leaned down toward Noah, ruffling the boy's blonde hair. I'll take it as a compliment. Noah giggled, clapping his sticky hands. Emily covered her mouth, torn between embarrassment and something far deeper that welled up unexpectedly in her chest. For years she had survived on her own, fear, exhaustion, and endless work. But now, sitting across from this man who had quietly opened a window in her heart, she wondered if life had just given her another chance she never saw coming. Outside, the sunlight turned golden, wrapping around the three of them like a promise neither was ready to admit, but both already felt. The next Sunday morning, sunlight filtered through the soft green canopy of Maplewood Park, scattering gentle flecks of gold across the playground. Emily hadn't expected to see him again, but fate has a way of showing up where reason fears to tread. She was pushing Noah on the swing, his laughter rising like music, when a familiar voice called from behind. Need a second pair of hands? She turned, heart skipping, to find Ethan standing there. Sleeves rolled, coffee in one hand, that same patient smile in the other. You again? She teased, trying to sound composed. You make it sound like a bad thing, he said, smirking as he joined her by the swing set. Noah squealed when he recognized him, waving both hands. Ethy! Ethan crouched down to the boy's level. Hey, champ! Remember me? Noah nodded enthusiastically, clutching his stuffed bunny. Emily couldn't help but smile. Something about the way Ethan talked to her son, not down to him, but with him, stirred a warmth she hadn't felt in years. You sure you're not following us? She asked playfully. I could say the same, he replied. This is my park, you know. Oh, really? She countered. Do CEOs own parks now? Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. No, but we show up at the right ones sometimes. They walked together along the winding path lined with benches and tulips, the air carrying the scent of cut grass and fresh earth. Noah toddled ahead, pointing at every dog and bird in sight, his tiny laughter weaving through their conversation. They sat on a bench, watching the boy chase after a butterfly, tripping every few steps but always getting up again. He's determined, Ethan said. Gets that from his mom, I think. Emily blushed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. He gets everything from me, including the stubbornness. Good, Ethan murmured, half under his breath. That's the best kind of strength. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't demand words. The late morning light bathed them in a soft glow, and Emily realized she hadn't felt this calm, this safe, in years. Then Noah came running back, his eyes wide with excitement. Look, Mommy Bird, he shouted, holding out a feather he'd found. Ethan grinned. That's a keeper, he said, taking the feather carefully and placing it in his pocket. Souvenir from our adventure. Noah giggled, clapping his small hands. As Ethan leaned forward to tie the boy's shoelace, a sudden burst of laughter erupted nearby. A group of kids racing with bubbles. Noah, too eager to join, tugged at Ethan's hand. Come play, he insisted. Before Ethan could respond, The boy tripped and fell right into his arms. But when Ethan stood, his face changed from surprise to disbelief. "Oh no," he muttered. Emily blinked. "What?" He looked down and she followed his gaze. The front of his beige pants was soaked. Her eyes widened in horror. "Noah!" she gasped, covering her mouth. "He didn't—" Ethan burst out laughing before she could finish. "Well, I guess that's one way to mark territory." Emily froze, torn between mortification and uncontrollable laughter. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." "Don't be," he interrupted, laughing harder. "You can't argue with nature." A little girl passing by pointed and asked loudly, "Mommy, why did that man pee his pants?" Ethan looked like he might die laughing, while Emily's laughter came out in breathless waves. "Stop laughing," she said between giggles. "You're making it worse." "It's already worse," he grinned. "Might as well enjoy it." When the laughter finally subsided, they collapsed onto the bench again, breathless but lighter than before. Emily looked at him, still smiling. "You're handling this better than most men would." "Trust me," he said. "I've survived tougher board meetings." The humor faded into a gentle quiet. She studied him. This man who could turn disaster into laughter, who could hold her child without hesitation. "You look like a real dad when you're with him," she said softly. Ethan didn't answer right away. He stared at Noah, who was now happily stacking pebbles, the sun glinting off his golden hair. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost wistful. "Sometimes I wish I were." Emily's chest tightened. The weight of his words sank into her heart like sunlight through glass, gentle but unshakable. She wanted to say something, to tell him that maybe he already was in all the ways that mattered. But instead, she simply smiled and watched him help Noah with his little pebble tower, the sound of their laughter floating through the summer air. And in that moment, Emily realized the world could still surprise her. Not with grand gestures, but with the simple grace of being seen, understood, and maybe slowly loved again. The following week arrived with sunlight so bright it almost felt cruel. Emily stood behind the counter of the small bakery, her apron dusted with flour, her heart still tangled from the laughter in the park days earlier. She had replayed every moment, the way Ethan had cradled Noah, the sound of their laughter, the ease that came so naturally. And for the first time in years, hope had slipped quietly into her chest. But hope, she knew, was dangerous. It never came without a price. That morning, as she arranged trays of warm muffins, a voice cut through the hum of the ovens, sharp, mocking. "So," said Marissa, her co-worker, leaning against the counter with folded arms, "you and your CEO boyfriend still playing house?" Emily froze, a tray halfway to the display shelf. "What are you talking about?" "Oh, please," Marissa scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Everyone saw the pictures. You two at the park, laughing, him carrying your kid like it's his. You really think a man like that sticks around? He's probably just being nice until he gets bored." The words sliced through Emily like a cold wind. She forced a small smile. "You don't know him." "I don't have to," Marissa said, smirking. "You're a single mom working part-time in a bakery. He's Ethan Cole. Wake up, Emily. People like him don't fall for people like us." The sentence lingered long after the ovens cooled. By noon, Emily had stopped speaking altogether. Her hands moved on instinct, kneading dough, frosting cupcakes, but her mind spun in circles of fear. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window of her small apartment, the city glowing faintly outside, Noah curled up beside her with his stuffed bunny pressed to his cheek. Her reflection in the glass looked foreign, a woman caught between wanting and warning. "Maybe she's right," she whispered. "Maybe I'm just pretending." She picked up her phone, typed and erased message after message. "Maybe we should slow down. You deserve someone simpler. This isn't going to work. but every time her finger hovered over send, she couldn't do it. Instead, she turned off her phone and pressed her forehead to the glass, watching the sunrise turn the city gold. The next morning, as she unlocked the bakery door, the bell above chimed, and she froze. Ethan stood there, sunlight spilling over his shoulders, his expression soft but searching. "You quit?" he asked. Her manager had called him after she'd walked out mid-shift the day before. She swallowed. "I just needed time to think." "About what?" he asked quietly. "About us?" She couldn't meet his gaze. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. "You've already been through enough. You don't need me or my mess." Ethan stepped closer, his voice calm but unwavering. "You're not a mess, Emily. You're the strongest person I know. I don't belong in your world," she said, her voice breaking. "You own companies. I barely own a car seat." He smiled faintly, taking another step forward. "Then I'll come to yours." She looked up at him, eyes wet with tears she didn't want him to see. "Why?" she whispered. "Because you make me remember what matters," he said simply. "For years, I've built walls and called them success. But when I see you with Noah, I realize I've been surviving, not living." His words cracked something open inside her, a quiet, aching truth she had buried under fear. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know," he replied. "So am I. But maybe that's how we know it's real." Noah stirred awake in the other room, his sleepy voice calling out, "Mommy?" Without hesitation, Ethan stepped around her, crouched by the door, and said softly, "Hey, buddy, I'm here." Noah blinked up at him and smiled. The sight was too much. Emily pressed a hand to her chest, breath trembling. She realized then that she had been running for so long, from pain, from hope, from the idea that someone might actually stay. And here he was, not promising perfection, not offering rescue, but something far rarer: presence. She met his eyes, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know if I can promise forever." "Then just promise today," he said. "We'll take care of the rest when it comes." In the pale morning light, surrounded by the scent of flour and sugar, Emily nodded. For the first time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, some people were meant to stay. Morning sunlight streamed through the wide front windows of the new bakery, Sugar Haven, bathing everything in gold. The air was filled with the scent of vanilla, caramel, and something softer: new beginnings. Emily stood behind the counter, her apron still crisp, her hands trembling as she ran her fingers along the glass display case. She could hardly believe it was real. Rows of pastel cupcakes, frosted eclairs, and fruit tarts gleamed beneath the warm lights. A week ago, she was working double shifts in someone else's kitchen, and now, here she was, standing in a place with her name written on the lease. "I still don't understand how this happened," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan leaned casually against the counter, sleeves rolled, that familiar calm smile tugging at his lips. "You worked for it. You built this." "You built it," she corrected gently. "You paid for everything." "Maybe," he said, "but you gave it purpose." His gaze held hers a beat too long, filled with the quiet admiration that always made her heart stumble. She tried to laugh it off, dusting imaginary flour from her apron. "You didn't have to do this for me." "I didn't," he said softly. "I did it for us." The words hung in the air, sweet and terrifying all at once. Before she could reply, the bell above the door chimed, and Noah came toddling in from the kitchen, his little hands covered in sprinkles. "Mommy, look!" he shouted proudly, showing her a half-decorated cupcake with far too many toppings. Ethan chuckled, crouching to wipe a streak of frosting from the boy's cheek. "Perfect," he said. "You've got real talent." Emily smiled at them, her son and the man who somehow made the world less heavy. For a fleeting moment, it felt like a picture of something she had always dreamed of, but never dared to expect. Later that afternoon, as the sun leaned low, customers began to drift in, locals curious about the new shop. Among them was a silver-haired woman who lingered near the counter, smiling as she watched Ethan helping Noah tie his shoelace. "You two make a beautiful family," the woman said kindly. Emily's heart skipped. She opened her mouth to correct her, but before she could, Ethan appeared beside her, holding Noah in one arm. He had heard every word. Without a trace of hesitation, he set Noah down on the counter, reached into his jacket, and pulled out a small velvet box. Emily froze. "Ethan, what are you doing?" she whispered. The bakery seemed to hush. Even the espresso machine quieted, as if the world itself had paused to listen. Ethan looked up at her, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Emily Hart," he began, "you've spent your life apologizing for taking up space, but from the first moment you walked into that cafe, you changed mine. You brought laughter back into a room I thought was closed forever." He opened the box. Inside sat a delicate gold band, simple yet gleaming in the afternoon light. "I know you never asked for anything, not this shop, not my help, not even my heart. But you have it. All of it. You and Noah both." Tears welled in Emily's eyes as the world blurred around her. "Ethan," she whispered, voice shaking. "I'm not—" "You're exactly enough," he said softly, stepping closer. "You're everything." Noah, sensing the magic in the air, began clapping his small hands, his laughter echoing through the quiet room. "Mommy happy?" he asked. Emily laughed through her tears, covering her face. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "Mommy's happy." The crowd of customers that had gathered watched in hushed awe as she nodded, a single trembling nod that carried every ounce of love, fear, and courage she had ever known. Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger. It wasn't diamond-studded or showy. It was simple, golden, honest, perfect. He leaned in, kissing her softly, the scent of sugar and vanilla swirling around them. Noah squealed and threw his little arms around both their necks, frosting smearing across Ethan's shirt. Laughter burst from everyone. Strangers smiling through tears, the silver-haired woman clasping her hands. Emily pressed her forehead against Ethan's, whispering, "You really want this? Me? Him? All of it?" Ethan's reply was steady and sure. "Especially all of it." Outside, the sunlight spilled across the bakery sign like a blessing, turning the words Sugar Haven into a promise. For the first time in years, Emily wasn't running or apologizing. She was home. Late morning sunlight drifted through the wide glass windows of Sugar Haven, turning the air golden and alive with the scent of vanilla and cinnamon. The once new bakery had become something more than a shop. It had become a place where stories were baked into every loaf, where laughter rose like bread in the oven, and where kindness lingered long after the last customer left. Emily stood behind the counter in a pale yellow apron, flour dusting her hair and cheeks like snow. She guided two children as they shaped cookie dough into clumsy hearts. "Remember," she said, smiling softly, "these are for the fundraiser, okay? No sneaking bites." The kids giggled, nodding solemnly as if entrusted with a royal secret. Across the room, Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a small circle of children, Noah at his side, their little wooden block tower growing taller with every laugh. The man who once lived behind boardroom walls now laughed freely, making engine sounds as the kids crashed toy cars into the tower. Emily watched him for a moment, sleeves rolled up, hair slightly messy, sunlight glinting off his wristwatch, and felt the familiar ache of gratitude that never seemed to fade. Every morning she woke to the hum of the espresso machine and the warmth of his quiet presence, and every night she fell asleep, knowing that she no longer had to face the world alone. Sugar Haven had grown into a haven for others, too. On Thursdays, Emily hosted free baking classes for kids from the local orphanage, teaching them how to whisk, fold, and dream. On Fridays, Ethan transformed the bakery into a small open mic stage where nervous teens read poetry or sang songs about heartbreak and hope. Word spread, but they never advertised. People came for the cupcakes and stayed for the peace that seemed to live in the walls. One sunny afternoon, Emily leaned against the doorway, watching Ethan juggle oranges for 3 squealing toddlers. He dropped one, and they erupted in laughter. "Show off," she teased. Ethan grinned, pretending to bow. "All part of the act," she smirked. "And is dropping them part of it, too?" "Only when I'm distracted," he said, walking over to her, lowering his voice just enough that she could feel the warmth of it against her skin. "By what?" she asked, her voice half teasing, half breathless. "By you," he murmured. She rolled her eyes, laughing softly, but didn't pull away when he slipped an arm around her waist. Together they looked across the room where Noah was teaching another boy how to roll frosting without breaking the piping bag. The sight made something deep in her chest swell. Not just pride, but the quiet knowledge that this was everything she had ever wanted, but never dared to ask for. "You know," she said after a moment, "since you walked into that cafe with your perfect hair and fancy watch, my baking's been different." "Different?" he asked, smiling. "Sweeter," she said, eyes glimmering. "Like something inside me melted." "Pretty sure that's just extra sugar," he teased. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "It's you." They stood there for a long time, listening to the laughter and the soft music playing in the background. On the far wall, above the display case filled with cupcakes and croissants, hung a small wooden sign carved with elegant looping letters. "Sometimes love doesn't knock. It walks in holding a child's hand." Emily traced the words with her gaze every morning, and every time she did, her heart tightened just a little, not in pain, but in awe. That phrase was their story, etched into wood and memory alike. From spilled water and shy smiles to the day Ethan knelt with a ring, from the quiet nights of doubt to this bright, bustling bakery filled with laughter, they had built something simple yet extraordinary, a home. As the day began to fade into soft golden light, Noah ran across the room, his cheeks flushed pink from play. "Mommy! Daddy made me a cape!" he shouted, showing off a towel tied around his shoulders. Ethan lifted him high, the child's laughter ringing through the shop like bells. Emily wiped her hands on her apron and smiled, her heart full to the brim. Outside, marigolds bloomed beneath the bakery window, their orange petals glowing in the late sun. Inside, 3 lives intertwined, not by blood or perfection, but by love that chose to stay. And for the first time in forever, Emily looked around and whispered to herself, "This is what home feels like." The scent of sugar lingered in the air. The sound of laughter wrapped around her, and in that golden moment of peace, everything she had lost found its way back, warm, alive, and beautifully, undeniably hers.